friends, welcome back to another Before You Read lecture for the Reading the Bible Together course at First Presbyterian Church of Atlanta. I want to welcome back those who have perhaps been a part of this group in the past, whether the recent past or the distant past. I also want to say welcome to those who may be new to this group, new to this format of doing some video lectures and some discussion on Zoom. Glad that you're here, regardless of what group you may have identify with. I want to say at the beginning that this study, this 5-week study, may feel a little bit different. It's going to have a bit more focused or measured engagement with the writings of the New Testament, and there will be more of an emphasis probably on the use of secondary scholarly resources, especially those written by Jewish scholars. Let me say here, as I'll also say in the email, that I would highly recommend you purchase the Jewish Annotated New Testament Study Bible, the second edition version. I'll provide a link in the email, but would love for you to purchase that. I'm going to provide some scans from that resource, but also if you want to pick one up for your own house, I think that would be quite good. I want to start our video lecture here with just sort of unpacking the title, right? So what's in the title, Reading the Gospel of John Without Antisemitism? I want to unpack each element of that. The first is anti-Semitism, the question of anti-Semitism and the related term anti-Judaism. And the place that I want to start here is with a short article by Dr. Amy Jill Levine on anti-Semitism in the New Testament. And she starts by saying that anti-Semitic readings would be those readings that suggest that the Jewish people are demonic, evil, or otherwise despicable. This is related to what she takes to be a more sort of standard definition of anti-Semitism, which is a racist view that regards Jews as a distinct people driven towards greed, political domination, and perversion. And so in her article, and really for this lecture and for this study, we are asking the question, is the New Testament anti-Jewish? Does it have an anti-Jewish tendency? Do particular writings within the New Testament promote anti-Judaism? And what Dr. Amy Jill Levine does is she sort of raises a number of reasons why scholars would say, no, the New Testament isn't anti-Semitic, or it's not anti-Jewish. And then she offers her own sort of response or rebuttal to those. So you might be familiar with some of these reasons why scholars would say, no way, the New Testament can't be anti-Jewish. The first is, some would say that there's a difference between the intention of the author and the later reception of the text. And they might point out that the authors of much, if not all, of the New Testament writings were themselves Jewish, writing to either mixed congregations or maybe in some cases congregations that were predominantly Jewish. And so you can't be anti-Jewish and be Jewish yourself, is the sort of argument there. It's only the later reception of the text, the use of the text in anti-Jewish ways, that has happened. A second reason why scholars would say, no, the New Testament isn't anti-Jewish, is they would say, we see similarly harsh critiques of Jews or Judaism in the Israel's prophetic literature. We see them in the very contemporaneous Dead Sea Scrolls, which have some really terrible things to say about other Jews of a different persuasion. A third reason that we might say, no, the New Testament is not anti-Jewish, is to say, well, it's simply reactive. It's reactive to dealing with a break from the synagogue or a recent sort of upheaval in the community. And therefore, it's almost extending a sense of empathy given that historical context. A fourth reason for saying no is that it can't be anti-Jewish because it simply celebrates Jewish concerns like the God of Israel or key figures like Moses or Abraham, or institutions like the temple or sacrifice. A fifth reason would be that there are similarly negative comments about Christianity among the rabbis within rabbinic Judaism. And so, seeing this as a sort of tit for tat, a sort of give and take among different religious groups. And finally, some would say it simply can't be anti-Jewish because it's divinely inspired. And how could God be anti-Jewish, right? That's the sort of rationale there. And as I said, Amy Jo Levine sort of responds to each of these as to how they're inadequate or how they might be skirting the issue. And so I think a sort of very simple test for us is, does the text of the New Testament, or does a reading of the text of the New Testament promote the hatred or the vilification or the demotion of the Jews or Judaism? Does it promote the hatred or vilification or the demotion of the Jews? If it does, whether it's the text or a reading of the text, then we could flag it as potentially problematic, as potentially anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic. That's the first part of the title of this class. The second part is reading without. And here, I think it's important that when I say reading without, what I'm recognizing, what I'm acknowledging is that each of us has agency as interpreters. We are not merely users of text. We're not merely readers of texts, rather. We are users of text. We make choices with how we read, how we understand these texts. And so we're acknowledging our agency as interpreters, but we're also acknowledging the potential of these texts, right? The potential of these texts to promote the hatred or the vilification or the demotion of the Jews or Judaism. Thus, when I say reading without anti-Semitism, I am saying that we are making a choice about how we are going to understand, how we are going to interpret a given text. And so it's really about a strategy or even a practice. And so we're going to be exploring that practice together using the Gospel of John as our sort of test case. Can we read the Gospel of John without anti-Semitism? What are the choices, what are the moves that we will make so that we read it in such a way that does not promote the hatred, the vilification, or the demotion of the Jews or the Jewish people? And then finally, the Gospel of John. Why are we reading the Gospel of John? Why are we focusing on the Gospel of John? Well, the short answer is that John contains some of the most problematic language about the Jews and Judaism. It also contains the most references to the word the Jews in all of the Gospel writers. The word the Jews occurs 62 times in the Gospel of John, compared to only 5 times in Matthew, 6 times in Mark, and 3 times in Luke. It, by a statistical analysis, is an important theme for us to consider. The next thing that I want to say more briefly is what are hermeneutical approaches? What are interpretive approaches or practices that we can use to read without anti-Semitism? And here I'm drawing on an excellent article by Dr. Abraham Smith on how Paul has been interpreted among African American readers. The article is in the True to Our Native Land commentary, which is an African American commentary on the New Testament. And so his focus is different. His focus is on how African Americans, particularly around the place of slavery and women's role in the church, have engaged Paul, how they have read Paul. And so I think that his exploration of these 5 approaches can help us as we approach the text of the Gospel of John. And so the first approach is what he calls radical rejection. And here, the text is purely problematic. There is no way to avoid the problems in the text. You simply don't read the text anymore, or you don't read it as normative or as an important text. An example is Howard Thurman's grandmother, who Howard Thurman recounts a story of reading the Bible to his grandmother who could not read. And she prohibited him from reading from most of Paul's letters, because for her, Paul was the great proponent of slavery. And therefore, she sort of rejected that. Although there's some nuance and some discussions that may not be entirely true. But you get the idea. Radical rejection is a pushing out the text, saying there's nothing that we can do with this text but ignore it, or silence it, or leave it alone altogether. On the other end of the spectrum is what Smith calls reverential appropriation. Reverential appropriation says that this text is completely problem-free. No issues, no problems, and therefore we honor these writings and we use them in our ethics, our religious practices, our theology, and even in our politics. Within these two extremes are three other responses to problematic texts. The first is what Smith calls intracanonical correction. And this is when you say, you recognize that a text is problematic, you recognize that a text, we might say, says something poor about women, or in our focus on this class, says something negative about the Jews or Judaism. You would then use another part of Scripture, either from the New Testament or the Old Testament, to clarify, or to interpret, or even to correct what you find to be problematic in the text. And so here, Luther's famous dictum that we should let that which is clear in Scripture interpret that which is unclear is similar. We're using something else to correct what we deem to be problematic or hard in the text. A fourth approach is what Smith calls extra-canonical correction. An extra-canonical correction is when we see a problem or theological issue in the text and we use something outside of Scripture to correct that problem. So here we could be using reason, we could be using history, we could be using our own experience, or we could be using non-canonical texts. Either Jewish non-canonical texts, Christian non-canonical texts, or even the wide range of Greek and Roman writings as well. And then the final approach is probably the most nuanced approach, but Smith calls it typological correlation. Typological correlation. And here is when you have flagged a problem in the text or a theological issue in the text, you think of a typology or an analogy maybe that can correlate to something else. And so an example would be, the Gospel of Matthew has some really terrible things to say about the Pharisees in chapter 23. Well, a typological correlation would say, okay, what if the Pharisees are just a type, right? So they're nothing uniquely or solely Jewish about them, but we would think about them more generally as religious leaders. And that's the correlation piece, right? So then we would say, what is something similar in our own world that is likened to the Pharisees? So this wouldn't be saying that there's this one unique group known as the Pharisees that are representative of all Jews everywhere, and therefore demonize all Jews everywhere. We would say, oh wait, what if this is just a critique of all of those people who like to be in the front in a religious community? What if this is a critique of all who take on religious leadership roles? And all of a sudden, that correlation opens the text up, maybe for us as Christians to hear it as an indictment against our own practices, rather than as a wedge to drive us further apart from our Jewish brothers and sisters. So again, 5 approaches that I think are helpful, and I think we'll circle back to these throughout our study. Finally, I just want to give you a sense of what you can expect for this week's readings and work together. The first is I'm sending via email a collection of all of the times that the phrase "the Jews" occurs in the Gospel of John. I'm just giving you the verses with very little context. And here is the simple exercise. I just want you to read the verses. There's about 65 of them. And I want you to evaluate on first blush, without looking into the context or even into the study notes. Simply decide, is this portrait of the Jews positive, negative, or neutral? Right? Positive, negative, or neutral. And then we'll discuss that together when we're on Zoom. In addition, I'm giving you a couple of articles on the Greek term, Iudaios, which is translated as Jew in the New Testament and in the Gospel of John, that will help give you some background. And then in the email this week, I'm also going to give you some additional optional background videos that explore the world of the New Testament, as well as sort of before you read lectures on the Gospel of John. If this is your first or second or newish time to reading the Gospel of John, you may want that overview of the Gospel of John. So friends, happy reading, and thanks again for exploring this topic together with me. We'll see you soon.